One of the most important elements of learning Sumerian in really any language is mastering the pronunciation. If you don't pronounce something correctly, you aren't really speaking the language. Unfortunately, we don't actually know how Sumerian sounded, but we do have a good idea of how Akkadian sounded. Now, Akkadian also had to be reconstructed. So we're getting this not even third hand, this is like fourth hand information. But we do have a pretty good idea of what Akkadian sounded like. And fortunately, Akkadian scribes were kind enough to transcribe Sumerian using consonants and vowels in their own language. This is a process called transliteration, and you will see this many, many times if you're not familiar with it. Now, it's great that the Akkadians wrote down what Sumerian sounded like to them until you realize that the Sumerian language had sounds that Akkadian didn't have. For example, Akkadians didn't differentiate between G and K. So to them, G and K were all the same sound, namely a K sound, K. So in some cases, we're going to have to take our best guess at what Sumerian sounded like. So let's start with pronouncing the Sumerian vowels. Depending on who you talk to, Sumerian had anywhere from 4 vowels to more than 9 vowels. And we know for sure that they had these 4 vowels, A, E, I, and U. I just want you to know that they may have had an O sound, but you're not going to see that anywhere for the most part unless you are a linguist. And if you are, you're probably learning Sumerian somewhere else, but just know that this is still a debated topic. These vowels are going to sound pretty much the same as what you see over here. So A like the ah in father, E like the A in way, E like the E in me, and U like the U, the OO sound in boot. Okay, pretty easy stuff. Pronouncing Sumerian consonants ranges from really easy to a little tricky, not too bad though. The following characters, you're going to see these a lot, and most English speakers are going to recognize these, and they're going to sound in Sumerian just like they sound in English. I mean, they may not have sounded exactly like that, but for the most part, it's going to be pretty close. So B like the B in boy, D like the D in dog, G like the G in girl, K like the K in kid, L like the L in lip. They may have had a palatalized L sound. Instead of like a regular L sound, it would have, you kind of slide the tip of your tongue back instead of it's more like That's a real possibility. Again, it's debated. M like the M in man, N like the N in no. Also may have been palatalized at some point. That N sounds like, so instead of N, it would have been which I realize sounds exactly the same. P like the P in peak, S like the S in yes, T like the T in tip, and Z like the Z in zebra, although some have suggested that it wasn't a Z sound at all, that it was either a TS sound like in blitz or a DZ sound as in lids. I think the case for the DZ sound is actually really good. When I go through and I'm pronouncing things, if you hear me say it like a DZ sound, that's what's going on. But for the most part, I'll probably end up saying it like a Z sound. You got to figure that one out yourself. You get to decide how you want to pronounce it. When learning Sumerian, there are a few consonants and sounds you might encounter that you may not be familiar with. Some of these are going to have special characters, but the sounds that they make are actually sounds that you can make very easily. Again, if you are a native English speaker. Some of these may come really easy to you or really difficult to you, depending on what your first language is. So this little R sound here with the little caret on top, you're not going to see this very often, but if you do see it, it probably sounds like the TS sound in bits. It's kind of like the voiceless counterpart to this Z sound, the Z sound. I don't know why we couldn't have come up with a better letter to represent this sound, but there it is. This S with the little caret on it sounds just like the SH sound in ship. It's just a sh. And this sound right here, we're going to talk about this more in a second, but the current consensus is, and I don't know how much of the consensus it really is. It's just what, everybody is doing right now. They're pronouncing this G like the NG sound in bring. So like a However, no one actually knows. I'm going to propose something here in a moment, and it's important because when I pronounce these things, as we're going through these lessons, I want you to know why I'm pronouncing it that way. And if you hear the sound, like that's what it is. So some special characters and sounds that you might not actually know or be comfortable with. First, we have this H with a little swoop underneath it. And this sounds just like the CH sound in Bach or the H in Russian. I mean, it's just a guttural H sound. H. We have R. It looks like a regular R, but it is not pronounced like the English R. It is not a sound. It is probably a tap or a trill, somewhere between R and R. Again, this little G sound. I'm going to talk about this more in a second. It may sound like a French R, or possibly like an Arabic hian, which is more of a, they're similar. One's a little bit farther back in the back of your throat, or like a ah. So a guttural G. And I'm going to come to this in a second. Akkadian sounds and consonants that you might encounter. This J is usually a diphthong or a semiglide, like the Y sound in hey. It's actually like E, but it's A. This Q that you will see quite a bit is kind of just like an emphatic or guttural K. So just more of a ka sound as opposed to just like a k. It's more of a k. This S with the dot under it is just a palatalized S. So instead of a S, it's more with your tongue a little bit farther back. So this T with the little dot or a little swoop, I'm not sure how sometimes it looks like a little comma underneath. This is just an emphatic or ejective stop, like a t. In all likelihood, all Sumerian words probably started with a consonant, including words that are just vowels now. One of the consonants that likely came before the vowels was a glottal stop. Some have speculated that it was an H sound, like a regular H. So not the ha, but a ha. Again, nobody knows for sure. The glottal stop is especially evident before ab, an, ib, between a and of so not just the lengthened which you may see somewhere. Before the locative case marker as in a instead of ea. Before the nominalizing suffix as in kiang Again, we don't know how, when, why, we don't know. So you can use them if you want. You don't have to. It's up to you. Pronouncing the consonant G with the little caret on the top. Now, the current consensus is that this should be pronounced like the NG in bring, which I definitely already told you. And the reason for this is that the Akkadians transliterated this sound right here as either N, G, M, NG, or MG. So either N, G, or I know that's like not even opening your mouth. MG. More specifically, they transliterated it or they transcribed it as a G or K when this, I'm just calling it this for now, when this was the first sound in the word. So instead of this G, IR, it became gir. When it was at the end of the word, they transcribed it as an N. And when it was in the middle of the word, they tended to write NG, and they didn't write NG like the English characters. They wrote their version of these sounds. Be aware that older Sumerology literature does not use this character at all. They're going to use either the G, K, N, NG, or MG. And this is why, if you're a fan of Zechariah Sitchin, you will probably know that he translates the word for God or deity as dingir, as two different words, dingir, or two different sounds. And he extrapolates on what these gods were based on those two words. But it was actually just one word, dingir or dingir, this word right here, which is probably all the evidence that anyone would need that Zechariah Sitchin did not actually speak Sumerian. Whether or not he was correct about some of his interpretations is an entirely different conversation that we can have sometime. All right, so again, the reason why they transliterated this sound as either an energy or an M usually is because they didn't have an equivalent sound. The fact that they had to use 3 different letters to transcribe this sound leads me to believe that whatever the sound actually was pretty far outside of their phonological capability. If you don't speak Russian, there are some sounds that most English speakers just have a really hard time with. An example would be E. It sounds like an E, it looks like an E, but it's actually more of an E. English speakers have a pretty easy time with the TH sound and Z, but some people just, they can't make the sound. They have no idea where to even start to make the sound. So instead, they have to use whatever the closest approximation is in their own alphabet so that they can write the sound down to help teach people. All that said, there is a sound which is made almost exactly in the same way as an NG or this NG sound, which I believe is just as likely to be the actual correct pronunciation. I have other reasoning for this. I will not be going into it right now. This lesson's already going to be way too long, and probably I am nitpicking over here about stuff that you don't really care about anyways. But in order to make this sound, all you have to do is make the NG sound, but just make it a little bit farther back in your throat. So you just go, right? So you're just going to push the back of your tongue way into the back of your throat. Just barely lift your tongue from the surface of your throat. So instead of, you're just going to lightly pull it down, just barely, right? So now we have a sound. So say guttural G, or like a ah, right? That's it. That's all we have to do. The sound you just made is this little upside down R symbol, which stands for a voiced uvular fricative, as in the French R, as in Paris, or this little G, sometimes it's written like this little Y with the little curly thing at the bottom. This is a voiced velar fricative, as in the Arabic or Persian ahan. So again, just a guttural G sound without any type of hard stop in there. My assertion is that depending on where we find this little G, and I put a G with a dot, so they kind of look similar. This is an acceptable translation of the aha sound. I propose that depending on where the sound was used, it actually did sound a little bit different, which is why the Akkadians transcribed it the way that they did. So when it was found at the beginning of a word, I suspect it was probably much more of a aha sound, more of the guttural G. So instead of nir, it would have been gir. At the end of the word, it was probably more of the NG sound, like more of a hard So instead of hun, which is what we see a lot of times in the Akkadian transcription, would have probably been closer to hum. And in the middle of the word, instead of dingir, which is how they often would have transcribed it, it would have been a combined NG-GH sound. So dingir. As I go through my transcription, that is how I usually pronounce it. So I want you to be aware of it. Another point of interest in here, that even though Sumerian is considered a language isolate, which means that it doesn't have any relatives that they're aware of, it's worth noting that this sound was present in the Canaanite, Hebrew, Aramaic, Southern Arabian, and Ethiopian languages. And I really don't think it's that much of a stretch to imagine that the Sumerians had a similar sound. Either way, like I said, nobody knows. Nobody knows for sure. And anybody who says they know, they're lying to your face. They do not know for sure. For all we know, this sound was just a palatalized N. So the sound, we don't know. You get to decide. Let me know what you think. Let me know which you find the most comfortable, and let's discuss. Why not? Just so you know, this wasn't the only consonant swapping that happened. We're not going to go through all these. You can read them, but just know when you come across these sounds that sometimes they got switched around by Akkadian scribes, and some of it depended on the time period, some of it depended on the city, the region. I mean, there's a lot of different factors that go into it. So just when you see some of this, it's not, it can be a little ambiguous. That's why. As for syllable emphasis or syllable emphasis, some people think that syllable emphasis played a role in Sumerian, possibly changing the pronunciation of the vowel. Some people suggest that the last syllable of the root of the word takes the emphasis. I fall into that category myself, but again, who knows? Maybe it's like Japanese, there's no emphasis at all. You could decide how you want to pronounce it. Let me know what you think.